Up next, you're going to meet a bloke who works essentially as a funeral celebrant, but he's just written a book about coping with grief. My next guest is there for people at one of the saddest times in life, a funeral. Dean Aitken is a funeral celebrant, and he's also the author of a new self-published book called Good Grief, a 5-step practical guide that helps with grief in its many forms. He's with me in our studio this morning. G'day, Dean.
G'day, Annie.
Can I just say before we talk that your book cover features a great photo of you looking like you're laughing your head off. Why did you choose that image for a book about grief?
I wanted to catch people's attention. And when we're talking about grief, as you said, there's a connotation that it's not good. So I wanted something that when you looked at it, you went, good grief.
How long have you been a funeral celebrant for?
6 years.
And what drew you to that kind of job?
I moved to the sunny coast and I was doing a diploma in business, and part of my business plan, I had to choose something, and I chose the lady, her name, who was Anne, said to me, Dean, I think you'd be a great celebrant. And I went, oh yeah, I could see myself marrying people on the Sunshine Coast. And she said, no, I think you'd be a great funeral celebrant. And I went, oh, how
did
morbid.
you respond to that?
Oh, I did. I just thought, really? Me? She said, you just got it. And I went, okay. I hadn't conducted any services. I'd been and given a number of eulogies, but that's just one important part of a service. When you're there for a whole family and all their friends, it's such an important role.
Sure is.
And I've got to say, Annie, it is the most fulfilling role I've ever had.
Wow. What was it in you that Anne identified that made her think you'd be a great funeral celebrant? Did she ever tell you?
No, she didn't tell me. I think it has a bit to do with my ability to connect with people. And I think I come across as real, And I think when you've got somebody up there representing your family, you want somebody that comes across as just a real everyday person who's genuine.
Let's talk about grief. You say grief is good. Your book is called Good Grief. Why is grief good?
Grief is natural. It's healthy. I named the book because it was an expression my father had. And he'd say, good grief, joy, with a few other expletives. So it was something that I was aware of very early in my life. And like everybody, I've experienced loss of something or someone in my life. So to me, Good Grief seemed like an appropriate title, and it seemed like it would engage people in a different way.
This is not just a book, though, about grieving the loss of somebody if they pass away, is it?
Not at all. Grief, just moving from Victoria to the Sunshine Coast. I lost all those friends and that network, and it was a new environment, and all the relationships I had at the shops and the cafes and in the community. It takes a while to sort of make a comeback or to make those connections again. And it's any time somebody loses a job. I deal with a lot of people that, are losing their hearing, their eyesight, their look that they had,
Aging.
Aging, yeah. So it's not just losing someone, it's losing something that you value.
What are the messages our society gives us about grief, do you think?
Well, I think there's a good example in the workplace. Some workplaces will give us 3 days leave because of, the family's going through grief. So in a sense, it sort of says, you've got 3 days to get over it and then get on with it. You need to be strong. There's all these cliched expressions I hear and platitudes I think, they're said with a good intention, but necessarily it doesn't mean that the person gets the opportunity to express themselves, express their grief. So there's a connotation that it's happened, they're probably in a better place now. But hey, I'm feeling really down. I'm feeling depressed or angry, or I'm in denial. I just need time. And it's so individual as our fingerprint. There's no prescription, there's no recipe, there's your own way for dealing with grief.
You mentioned denial there, and there are some well-known documented stages of grief, and the first of those is denial. I can't believe they're gone. I can't believe this happened to them. Where are they? Why aren't they here anymore? And we move on. But you've expanded this out quite a bit based on your own observations. It almost looks to me, reading through your book, that you've put quite a bit of reflection into your own grief and loss to sort of explore the topic of grief. Is that a fair observation?
Yeah, it is. And, denial's an interesting stage of grief. Having close friends around you reflecting perhaps what you're saying or what you're expressing helps to just gradually bring you out of that. I think when it comes to denial, it's something that happens over time, and it just comes through simply just noticing where you are and how you're feeling. Like, I don't know any of yourself, but you might be walking in a supermarket and a piece of music comes on, and that piece of music takes you right there to that moment you first heard it or shared it with somebody special, or you smell a fragrance, a perfume or an aftershave, and again you're like, wow, I'm there. And those little things bring us out of that denial and bring us into, I'm grieving, and grieving is okay.
You've looked at some of the other themes as part of grief: becoming aware, acknowledgement, learning acceptance, learning tolerance, and self-care. Talk to me about awareness.
Sometimes I'm just caught up in life and I'm walking down, Mooloolaba Beach, and I'm caught up in my own world. And then other moments I just stop and I notice, the waves coming in and the birds that are around me and the amount of people. So awareness, again, is something simple as just noticing what's happening around you and how you're feeling. And I think a really good way to help us with that awareness is perhaps just journaling what's happening for us and being able to sit down and reflect on that journal. And that sort of brings us things to our attention, because a lot of the thoughts that we have and feelings we have are similar to what we had the day before. And then all of a sudden you start to see a pattern. You go, wow, this is a reoccurring experience for me.
How does that help us with grief?
Again, it helps us bring us out of that denial. It helps us bring us into the present moment. It helps us to weave that grief into our lives rather than it's quite separate. I'm going to keep myself busy right now. And for me, I talk about it in the book, I'm a comfort eater. When I feel distressed or uncomfortable, I eat, and that certainly helps. I'm not a big drinker. I don't gamble. I'm not a big shopper. But it was either eat or exercise, and they're two simple ways to regulate that grief that we're experiencing. But I don't know about you. Sometimes that eating can be unhealthy, and sometimes that exercise could be too much and creating more stress and more grief.
You make a point as a celebrant of going back and checking in on families a few weeks after you've conducted their funeral service for them. Why do you do that?
It's so important. Initially in that early stage of losing someone, and it doesn't matter whether it's been, happening over the last 6, 12 months or 10 and 20 years. I've got a family tomorrow I'm looking after that's had Parkinson's for 20 years. It's still that loss of someone they love. I go back because in that initial stage they're quite numb, and our bodies naturally, we're crying and we're getting, in some cases, a lot of company, and we're not really getting the full experience because our body is secreting these sedative type chemicals that just numb the rawness of that loss. In about 3 to 5 weeks, they start to feel that rawness again. So for me, it's just checking in with them and not asking how are they, but what are they doing to take care of themselves at this point in time.
How much have you seen funerals and the way families approach funerals these days? How much has that changed in the 6 years that you've been a funeral celebrant?
Once upon a time, most of the people who were conducting the services were ministers, pastors, reverends, and today I think it's well over 60% of services are conducted, and mostly by a celebrant, and they're a female, which says a great deal about women and their ability, I guess their capacity and their compassion during such a difficult time. I think the important thing is, in most cases, families are giving their loved one a rite of passage. They're giving them an opportunity to get some closure. And as much as the loved one might say, I don't want a service, it's important for the family to get that closure.
The people that are left behind, yeah.
Yeah, that's so important.
Further down the track, when people are still grieving quite some years on after the loss of a loved one, what's your advice to that when people feel that loss in such a strong way?
Yeah, well, in my own case, it took me some time just to own up to it. I was definitely in denial. And again, it was through the companionship of some really good friends, some great mates, who sort of suggested to me, Dean, have you thought about some professional help? Yeah, for my way of thinking, if I'm stuck and my friends are no longer able to help me in this way, I need to go and find someone who's dealing with grief every day in a professional role.
Dean Aitken on ABC Sunshine Coast, and speaking there about his book, Good Grief. And if you're keen to go and catch up with him and find out more about the book, he's doing some signings at Annie's bookstore in Peregian this Sunday between 10 a.m. and 12 noon.